Hello and welcome to the first in the Pause in the Storm series that with Haymarket Books. We're hoping that this series will act as a way for people to access some ideas and thoughts and conversations that can just give us a little bit of space for reflection, that kind of 20 minutes or half an hour in your day to think about both the horrors and the hopes of the world. My name's Gargi Bhattacharya. I work at the University of East London, and I write around issues of race and racism and racial capitalism. I'm really overexcited today. If you come again, you'll see I'm always overexcited to speak to Rory Fanning, who is a very well-known Haymarket author. I realise some of you will probably already know, because that's why you've come, that he's the author of Worth Fighting For, An Army Ranger's Journey Out of the Military and Across America. Rory walked across the United States to raise money for the Pat Tillman Foundation between 2008 and 2009. After being deployed in Afghanistan twice with the 2nd Army Ranger Battalion, he's a war resister, a military counter-recruiter, and a writer who lives in Chicago. He's also the co-author of Long Shot, The Triumphs and Struggle of an NBA Freedom Fighter with Craig Hodges. Today, I think we're going to have a conversation which is partly about the Worth Fighting For book, but given the moment we're speaking in, is probably about the ways in which Rory's life's work might help us reflect on the particular moment we're in. And I guess for the future, I should say, we're speaking in late summer 2021, which one day people will forget why this is just such a horrible time. So I'm so very pleased to meet you via the screen, Rory. And I wondered if, as you could predict, the first thing I wanted to kind of ask you about is how, given your own history and your own life's commitment to working for peace, how we might just begin to register this particular moment of rapid abandonment of Afghanistan. And what do you think? I was going to ask you, why is the United States choosing this tactic in this moment? I wonder if that's something that you could shed a little light on.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on the show, Gargi. I'm honored to be taking part of this, taking part in this. Those are some big questions, and how we look at what has happened. I guess you start with, the pretty basic point that, actions have consequences. And there wasn't a ton of debate leading into the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. There was only a handful of public figures, maybe one or two congressional members who voted against the invasion of Afghanistan. And 20 years later, we are still feeling the repercussions of that lack of debate. Of course, I think there are plenty of socialists that spoke out against the invasion of Afghanistan. And I think having a worldview that understands things like exploitation and oppression, the impact of imperialism around the world, particularly U.S. imperialism, kind of foretold a lot of what we're seeing now. And so now we are at a point where we're dealing with not only trillions of wasted dollars, but also tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives lost, mostly innocent civilians, over the last 20 years. And now we're confronted with a horrible refugee crisis, and how we are supposed to deal with that. And I think there is no other solution other than bringing as many Afghans to leave Afghanistan here to America or elsewhere where they'd be safe. The U.S. started this. We've been meddling in at the affairs of Afghanistan for more than 40 years, at least. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that all of the people who want to leave Afghanistan, and not just the people who facilitated the occupation, but all Afghans who would like to leave have a place to go. after this horrible occupation that, is thankfully wrapping up. I mean, there's a bit of mixed emotions happening here. I mean, it's great that the U.S. is finally leaving Afghanistan. They should have never invaded in the first place, but it's also now, what do we do going forward?
No, of course. And actually, the things I wanted to ask you about, or much more about, I started with that because of where we are. But when I told you I read your whole book today, just kind of cover to cover like this, and I really thought that it's so much a book about managing and processing and living with grief. I know both the grief of a particular loss, but also a kind of, felt to me like, a kind of bigger grief of being in this world of violence. And I wondered if both the project of the walking and the project of the writing were ways of dealing with both personal and huge grief, or whether that makes sense to you as a reading of the book.
Yeah, I think walking in particular was a great experience in terms of just getting away, having the opportunity to visit with people as long or as short of a time as I wanted. It was after I left the military, it was very difficult for me to just have ordinary conversations with people, look people in the eye, and just kind of present with them. And there was kind of a magic in walking 20 miles a day with 50 pounds on my back. I don't know if it was magic or masochism, but it was a way to kind of just break myself down a little bit. And, if I do have a center, try to find it. And I met some incredible people along the way. A lot of people, they do talk a lot about a divided country, and here in the United States, and with our history of racism and oppression and exploitation, there is some very, very bad ideas floating around the United States. But I think a lot of people are manipulated by the ruling class in the United States, and they have a degree of mixed consciousness. They argue for things they actually don't benefit from, and it was interesting to see that so many people out there are in so many ways trying to do the best with what they have been given, and trying to make the world a better place, even if in many cases it's doing the opposite. So all that's to say is I had a lot of really great experiences walking across the country, and that's not to say I'm a white guy walking across the United States for a fallen war hero. Right, left, up, and down. People kind of embraced Pat Tillman, the person I walked across the country for. It's far safer for a white guy to walk across the United States than someone else. So, so putting all that into the air when discussing this, I will say that I did meet a lot of extraordinary people in my walk.
No. Well, both of those things are things I'd hope to talk to you more about. That, and you'd sent me another article as well about the importance of one-to-one conversations, and a lot of the book is interspersed conversations of your journey, as well as these snippets of history and experience. And as you say, it kind of gives you a much more textured picture of what American society is like. Not all rosy, because some people say some kind of really troubling things to you, and you have to say, not sure I'm going to agree about this. But there's a kind of pause in judgment that there's just all these people, and they bring you a sandwich, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the importance of the one-to-one conversations, both in your journey and it sounds like in your ongoing political practice, that the one-to-one is where we make the world.
Yeah, I mean, one-to-one is, it can be daunting and scary sometimes to actually sit there and be present with someone and kind of open yourself up and, answer questions and also have that person open up to you and be honest with. But I think it's one of the more real things you can do as a human being is just sit down and have a conversation. Particularly in an era of, YouTube comments and Facebook comments where I don't think, it necessarily captures who people actually are. I don't know how to break that down further, but I do think that getting away from screens, getting away from the Twitter comments and actually just getting in front of people is a much better way to get to know people than internet and all that type of thing. And
now that's interesting you say that, because I hadn't even thought of it as an anti-tech thing. In my own kind of patchy political history, I was very much trained as a younger person to speak publicly, because that's a really valorized thing across progressive movements. And as a young woman, it was good. They wanted to have a young woman on the platform. So, that you learn to give the speech. And I really think, it was easier speaking to 250 or 1,000 people than to one other person. And I wondered if there's something in that as well about the conversations we think are the activist conversations, or the conversations that will make something different happen. Because it's a very different choice to say, well, actually, I'm not going to stand on a platform and write my manifesto. I'm going to say, I'd like to hear what you've got to say, and maybe you would like to hear what I've got to say, which is more what I thought maybe you were talking about in the short article, maybe as well.
That's a great point. I mean, 100%, and I think, there is a whole other language beyond just words, body language and eye contact and all those things you lose, I think, through, virtual conversations or even presentations. Not to, there's certainly a place for organizing online, and there's certainly a place for public speaking. I mean, it's one of the more daunting things people can do, and I have a lot of respect for people who do it and do it well. But there's a lack of intimacy sometimes when it comes to public speaking or certainly virtual conversations. There's an illusion of intimacy sometimes because people just can say anything that they want online. But, when you're present with somebody, I think you're going to see a better version of people a lot of times. And you can demand more, I think, in mutual ways when you're sitting down having a one-on-one conversation with somebody.
I love that thing that you said about seeing a better version of people. And I guess that's part of what is so moving about the book is telling these histories of violence, but as you say, also telling these many, many stories of people kind of trying to show you their best side, even when sometimes it's their racist side or their celebration of gun owning side. It's often like, there's something else. And I don't know if this is a proper thing to ask in a kind of left podcast thing, but I thought it was very much a book about spirituality. You say at the beginning that one of the things that happened to you is that you were of faith and you became an atheist. But I thought lots of things about across religious traditions, the kind of relinquishing of physical comfort, the giving away of possessions, the long walk, the kind of walk of penance, the meeting people as they stand before you. It's a kind of remaking of spirit, isn't it? A collective remaking of spirit. And I guess I kind of wanted to ask you a bit more about what we might do with that need for rebuilding our collective spirit. As I'm an atheist as well, but in our dreaming of a better world, because that felt, don't have to believe in a big creator to think, oh, well, we need to remake our love for each other and be able to see each other as our best selves and relinquish self. I feel like I'm kind of being a bit of overly fandom-like to you because I only read it today, but other people must have said this to you. It felt like, oh yes. How do you live in the world which tells you to be alone and ambitious and bigging yourself up and defensive every day because the world is full of danger, and say, I think the world can be better than this, and how I'll make it better than this is to say, I'll strip it away. And when I've stripped it away, I'll come and talk to you.
Yes. So a part of the reason I kind of left religion is because I think I was justifying too much. I think you can easily interpret any injustice in the world as part of being a larger plan that could be, just beyond human understanding. And that to me was kind of atrophying my brain in a lot of ways. And I didn't want to spend my entire life kind of brushing off injustice. I wanted to get to the root of it and figure out why, injustices were happening. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of kind of good takeaways from, a religious-minded kind of person. I think, having an idea or believing in something that is bigger than yourself, I think is healthy to get out of yourself, particularly in a hyper-alienated society where everybody is atomized and kind of by themselves. And, it's really easy to kind of go really into yourself. And that's not to say that you should not be very self-aware and, identify what your needs are and advocate for them. But I do think there needs to be kind of a balance. And I think religion sometimes takes people out of themselves in a healthy way. And I think sometimes takes people too much out of themselves. But I think because I was a religious kid, and always wanted, in large part because I was scared of death. I think that's why a lot of people turn, and that's why I'm also very sympathetic to people who turn to religion. Being a human being is not an easy thing. The world is scary. Death is scary. And to have a story that kind of helps wrap your mind around all this, I think is very comforting. And I can appreciate that. But I do think, being humble in a lot of times keeps you learning. And I think, at least certain religious denominations preach humility. I think that's an important quality. The U.S. certainly could have used some humility before it decided to invade Afghanistan. There's the chauvinism that the U.S. carries around is just mind-boggling.
And I was going to come around to that because the first thing I thought I was going to ask you when I first heard we were going to speak was, how is it that not only the US population, but all powerful nations' populations are still so seduced by the military machine, not only in terms of joining, but the whole set of rituals and symbols around what it is to be a highly militarized society. And then after reading your book, I wondered if, instead of saying to you, why are people so violent? Actually, why is the wish to serve so effectively sucked in by the rhetoric and the institutions of the military? Because so nearly everyone you met of all political denomination was saying, oh yes, service. Well, a life of service. You're celebrating a life of service. I try to serve. And I thought, that's not the same as go out and kill my enemies, as a way of people becoming seduced. I think it is a seduction that it becomes, and I wouldn't say that Britain is not a highly militarized society. It's just a differently militarized society, and that people, as you say, want to be part of something bigger and feel that the pains of their life have meaning. And is service still because then we need to change what we say. We need to stop being so violent, and understand instead the logic of how the wish to serve, the very thing that progressive people also believe, gets taken away for this violent machine. Does that? Do you see what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, and there's a reason the United States spends up to $1 billion a year on advertising, not including video games, not including movies. And I think they manipulate people's best intentions very, very strategically, and they, this is service. In my experience, the military is the opposite of service. When the purpose of the military is to steal other countries' natural resources and claim, spheres of influence in parts of the world the U.S. has no business being in, that is not a service. That is a theft. That is a violent, manipulation of other people. And I think, the U.S. military has found a way to tap into people's best qualities and use that as a force for bad as opposed to good. And I think that explains a lot of, if you talk to people who have actually been overseas in kind of combat situations or have actually seen, what the U.S. is doing around the world, they're less motivated and enthusiastic about. And I think there's a huge sense of betrayal in a lot of ways. And I go into colleges and high schools and talk to young people about the things that recruiters ignore when they're trying to sell the military to young people. And they can tell you very little about the last 20-year occupation in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, much less the war in Vietnam or the 100 years of U.S. imperialism, if not more, that the U.S. has kind of been imposing on the rest of the world. And I think that explains a little bit of the betrayal, because they're sold you're going out to fight for freedom and democracy. And then when they realize they're only fighting to make a small percentage of the population wealthier, or they're fighting and innocent people are dying. I think as many as 80 to 85% of all the people who have died since 2001 have been innocent civilians. There's a horror in that recognition and realization. And I mean, the people who sit behind desks and who never really kind of engage, are the ones that are cheerleading for U.S. empire. But it's I think you're more likely to find people out there who reject the U.S. mission around the world when they've actually seen it up close and personal.
No, it's so interesting to me also that now so much of your work is resisting army recruiters, because in the book you're trying to hold back on that. You have one moment in a school where the kids are all like, "Oh, you're a veteran, hooray, hooray," and you have to say something like, "No, don't join the army," and it's kind of like. And I wondered, and that's interesting for me also to hear that in America there's been a silencing for younger people of even the recent history of wars, because that's very much happened in Britain as well. But having been the core of ideological battle really in the country, and Britain was very, very divided about Iraq, and it's still a kind of fissure in political culture, then there's been a kind of say nothing. Even as British troops are there and dying and coming back in pieces, it's like, don't mention that, don't mention that. So I wondered how do the young people you meet approach the military? Is there still that enthusiasm for this as a path to a meaningful life of service? Or have things changed post-austerity? I think people, certainly in Britain, are much more critical of capitalism, including quite middle-of-the-road people, because of all of the failures. People lost everything. Has that changed the kind of the mystique around a military life?
Well, I think it depends on where you go. And I've certainly seen a shift over the years when you've seen blunder after blunder, and embarrassment after embarrassment, and a realization that the U.S. is not fighting for freedom and democracy around the world. It's quite the opposite. But U.S. military targets people who have the least amount of options after graduations. And if you go to the South and West Side, and that's the areas that the recruiters are going to the most here in Chicago. And, this largely Black and brown community with, who see the military as a way to pay for college education, maybe to get some health care, and maybe to find a degree of structure that they may not have otherwise had because of poverty and racism. And so, it depends on what your motivation's for. And, the U.S. government, makes education so expensive because if there was free college education, there'd be far less people signing up to join, one of the 800 military bases around the world. Because why would you go fight and put yourself through all that if you could just to get an education when you can get it for free? And there's other people that certainly still do buy into the chauvinistic kind of, belief that the United States is a force for good in the world, and we have to, if the U.S. doesn't act like the policeman around the world, then someone else will. And, again, that goes back to the marketing and the public, the propaganda and the lack of news coverage of all the things that are happening around the world.
No, of course.
People just don't see it. People don't see the.
Yes, I mean, certainly there's been a really willful silencing of any news in Britain about, the last, I would have said maybe for the last 10 years, things have been completely like, we don't see anymore what's going on, and that changes people's available narratives, although it's very notable that one of the ways in which British media and the British kind of political class has expressed kind of their disquiet with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because clearly Britain then feels like America's decided and we don't know what we're doing, is what about all the British deaths? And you've even had people from the British military saying, well, then you're saying that all the deaths of those people was for nothing. And it's very hard as the anti-war movement really is, without being completely callous, it's very hard. What else can you say? And as you say, that the military here also sucks up young people from the least enfranchised areas of the country where the economy is collapsed, has very, very high levels of illiteracy amongst people who join as young people. This is a collective failure. One of the other things I thought was really beautifully done in your book, without any preachiness, was the kind of parallel narrative of all of the lovely little stories of meeting ordinary Americans as you walk down the road. Alongside that, the history of extreme racialized violence, ethnic cleansing, genocide, lynching, the aftermath of a slave society, as you go through the spaces. So you tell these little stories just to say, oh, look, each space, there's blood here as well. And I wondered if that was also part of your quiet critique of what a society built on violence is, or whether there's any more you might say about the connection between being the primary military power in the world, or one of the primary military powers in the world, and being a society that still has this very recent history of bloody racialized violence just embedded in its landscape, that as you walk along.
Yeah, there's a lot of contradictions in America, and there's many horrors that do not get discussed nearly as much as they should, and they get swept underneath the rug. And the challenge is how do you discuss those horrors without writing off an entire society and saying, this is unsalvageable. And, emphasizing the goodness of people, I think, is, just as important as highlighting the horrors that people are capable of. And finding that right balance is always a struggle. And in terms of, how you communicate these histories. And I do think you have to have a sense that there is a possibility for change. And there's a possibility for change because there is a goodness in most people. And, when you shine a light on the darkness that is, a ubiquitous presence in the United States, I think, you acknowledge it, but you can also then start growing, knowing that, people are do have the potential to do good things. So it's not an easy thing. And I don't know how well of a job I did, but I just tried to show, that yes, there's been horrors, but there is still a possibility for change if you know how to communicate better ideas to people, ideas that they may not have otherwise been exposed to. The government has done, through red baiting and Cold War propaganda, have done a really good job about mischaracterizing things like socialism, stripping the vocabulary for self-liberation out of, the minds of people. People don't know what's happening to them a lot of the times. And if you can explain that, maybe there's a possibility that they can choose a better path going forward.
No, of course. And that's what a lovely place to end with, really, because what we hope is that however terrible things might seem, that people might sit with us for a moment and just remember our resources for imagining a better future. So it's been lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.